schoolhouse burned like a beast unleashed, walls shaking as flames devoured them. Smoke thickened, stealing breath in sight, while children's cries split the roar. Evelyn fought forward, desperate for each small face. Then, through a shower of sparks, a figure burst inside, coat singed, boots pounding the scorched floor. He shoved debris aside, drove the children toward escape, and reached for her without pause. Flames ripped through the old schoolhouse, smoke choking the cries of 17 orphaned children. In the chaos, she saw him, a shadow in the doorway, moving through fire as if it feared him. His coat was scorched, his eyes fierce, and in his arms he carried her like she weighed nothing. She didn't know his name, but she knew this. Whoever he was, he had just saved her life, and maybe her heart. Late spring of 1879 brought no mercy to Texas. The sun loomed like a molten coin in a sky the color of bone, baking the land until the earth cracked and the wind carried more grit than comfort. Redford Hollow lay huddled against the horizon, a scattering of weathered buildings, their wooden siding bleached pale by years of heat and dust. Shutters hung crooked, creaking when the occasional breeze passed through. It was the kind of place where news traveled faster than trains, and strangers were measured with quiet, unblinking eyes. When the morning train groaned into the station, its iron wheels squealing, the few townsfolk who lingered there turned to watch. Evelyn Hart stepped down from the last carriage, the hem of her travel-worn skirt brushing the dusty platform. She gripped a weathered carpet bag in one hand, the strap of a satchel in the other. From that satchel protruded a sealed envelope, stamped with the crest of the County Court of Galveston. Inside was more than a formal assignment. It was a plea for help. She paused to take in the town. The saloon's swinging doors moved idly in the breeze, though no one came or went. The general store's sign hung askew, its lettering faded. Men leaned against porch rails, their hats pulled low, watching her as though she were a card they hadn't yet decided to play. Evelyn knew the look. She'd seen it in other hard towns. The silent calculation of whether someone belonged or would soon be gone. Her purpose, however, was not up for debate. 17 children waited for her. 17 Mercer orphans, all bearing the same last name as if it were a banner and a burden. Their parents, 2 brothers and their wives, had been cut down in an ambush on the disputed cattle trails. Their homestead burned to ash. No one in Redford Hollow had stepped forward to claim them. No one had dared. A tall man with a bent back and tobacco-stained lips eyed her from the freight ramp. "You the new school teacher?" he asked. Evelyn straightened. "Not a teacher," she replied, her voice steady. "The last hope they've got." He spat into the dirt and smirked. "They're wild like wolves. Hope you're tougher than you look." She didn't answer, just adjusted her grip on the carpet bag and stepped off the platform. Whatever waited ahead, dust, doubt, or defiance, she was ready to face it. The building that passed for a schoolhouse stood at the far edge of Redford Hollow, where the prairie grass began to swallow the town's last fence line. Once an old hay barn, it leaned slightly to one side, its doors warped by years of heat and neglect. One door hung crooked on rusted hinges, the other nailed shut with boards gray from weather. The roof sagged in the middle, as if it had long since given up trying to stand proud. Dust lay thick on the floorboards and cobwebs draped the corners like ghostly curtains. Evelyn Hart set down her carpet bag in the center of the room and took a slow breath. The air was heavy with the smell of old hay, dry wood, and something faintly sour. She rolled up her sleeves and began. By the first afternoon, she had swept years of dirt into neat piles, dragged broken barrels into the yard, and found 2 wobbly benches that could still serve. She patched holes in the walls with scraps of plank from the shed behind the blacksmith's shop. At night, she slept on a cot in the corner, the hollow silence of the barn her only company. For 2 days, she saw no sign of the Mercer children. Still, she heard them. Whispers drifted through the slats in the wall after sundown. The quick, hushed tones of watchers deciding if she was worth stepping into the light. Evelyn left the front door open, a bowl of water on the steps, and a small loaf of bread on the desk. Each morning, both were gone. On the 3rd day, they came. 17 of them, ranging from 5 to 13, stood in the doorway like shadows cut from the same cloth. Their faces were sun-darkened, their expressions blank, their bodies still as fence posts. Evelyn greeted them, asking for their names. No one spoke. She didn't press. Instead, she picked up a twig, drew a line in the dirt, and began to tell a story. Not a lesson, but a tale about a girl who learned to read from words carved into leaves and stones. They listened without moving, their eyes unreadable. The next morning, Evelyn found a small bundle of wildflowers on her desk, tied with a piece of twine. No note, no name. But it was enough to tell her the wall between them had its first crack. From the crest of a low hill just beyond the schoolyard, a twisted old oak stood against the sky, its roots clutching the earth like a stubborn sentinel. Beneath its shade, a man often lingered, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered coat, even in the heat of late spring. Graham Cole, owner of one of the largest cattle spreads in 3 counties, was known in Redford Hollow less for his wealth than for his silence. He spoke little, kept to himself, and rode into town only when necessity forced his hand. Yet from that hill, his sharp blue eyes seldom left the barn that Evelyn Hart had begun to turn into a schoolhouse. He'd seen strangers come and go before, each one promising to bring order to the Wild Mercer orphans. None had lasted more than a month. But something in the way Evelyn moved, sleeves rolled, jaw set, determined against dust and decay, kept him watching. One morning, a roof slat over the desk sagged low enough to let daylight pour through. That afternoon, Evelyn returned from hauling water to find it mended. The work was clean, the nails driven true, but there'd been no sound of a hammer, no sight of a ladder. She puzzled over it, but the children only shrugged. A week later, a tin box appeared on the windowsill. Inside 6 ginger cookies, the kind the local bakery rarely made anymore, and a copy of the Prairie Reader, pages carefully kept from curling. No note accompanied it. Evelyn set the cookies on a plate and left them in the center of the room. They were gone before lessons began. These small mysteries began to stitch themselves into the rhythm of the days. The children still carried the wariness of strays, but the air in the barn was changing. When Evelyn told her evening stories, she noticed shoulders easing, lips twitching toward smiles. One boy dared a soft laugh when she acted out a fox's clever trick. A girl covered her mouth to hide her grin. From his place beneath the oak, Graham heard it too, the sound of laughter in a place that had been silent far too long. He didn't step forward, not yet, for now it was enough to keep watch, to mend what he could in secret, and to know that the old barn was beginning to sound alive again. The late afternoon sun slanted through the gaps in the barn's walls, turning the dust motes into drifting flecks of gold. Evelyn Hart had stayed after the children left, determined to clear out the last of the clutter in the far corner. The old barn still carried the bones of its former life. Rusted harness buckles, splintered fence posts, and a pile of warped crates stacked like forgotten relics. She knelt to pry up one stubborn floorboard, the wood swollen from years of heat. With a groan it gave way, revealing a shallow space beneath. Her hand brushed against cold metal. A rusted iron ring bolted to the subfloor. She pulled, and an old trunk emerged, its leather edges cracked, the lid scorched at the corners as if it had once been kissed by fire. The lock had long since broken, so she lifted it open. A faint smell of smoke and old paper rose into the air. On top lay a folded tarp and a moth-eaten blanket. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a heavy ledger bound in dark leather. Dust clung to its cover. Evelyn carried it to the desk, her fingers trembling as she turned the first page. The handwriting inside was neat, deliberate, the kind of script that knew its words mattered. Across hundreds of pages, names and dates filled the lines, records of cattle sales, supply deliveries, and visitors to the Mercer homestead. The entries reached back nearly 10 years, ending just a week before the murders. Some names she recognized, neighboring ranchers, the town doctor. But one name appeared again and again, each time underlined. Marcus Vane. Her stomach tightened. Vane wasn't just the mayor of Redford Hollow. He was the man who held sway over land disputes and cattle routes. Paired with his name were coded notations, delivery tallies, and in the back of the ledger, a crude hand-drawn map. The Mercer Ranch lay in the center, marked with red pencil as temporary access. Oh, The signature beneath it was unmistakable, Marcus Vane's own hand. Evelyn closed the book slowly, the air around her suddenly feeling thinner. A floorboard creaked outside. She froze, listening. No wind, no footsteps retreating. Someone had been there, watching. The skin along her neck prickled. She tucked the ledger into her satchel, bolted the door, and told herself one thing. Whatever she had just uncovered, it was dangerous enough to kill for. The day began like any other, with the smell of chalk dust and the sound of pencils scratching over paper. The Mercer children were bent over their lessons when the wind shifted. Evelyn Hart noticed it first, a subtle heaviness in the air, like the sky was holding its breath. Then Noah's nose wrinkled, his eyes darting upward. "Miss Hart, something's burning." Before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the rafters. Smoke seeped from the back corner, curling into the room in thin, sinister fingers. In seconds, the dry hay in the loft caught, erupting into a wall of flame that licked greedily toward the roof. "Stay low," Evelyn shouted, her voice hoarse over the sudden roar. She herded the children toward the front, but the main doors were already aflame, the boards splitting under the heat. Heat slammed into her face, her eyes watered. The children coughed, panicked, huddling close. Then the back door exploded inward. A figure filled the doorway, tall, broad, and moving, with the surety of a man who feared nothing. Graham Cole stepped into the inferno, a wet blanket slung over one shoulder, his coat already singed. Without a word, he strode forward, scooping up the smallest child and shoving fallen debris aside with one boot. "Follow me," he barked, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. One by one, he pushed the children toward the rear escape he'd carved open, the wet blanket shielding them from falling embers. When all 17 had passed through, he turned back for Evelyn, who was still scanning the room to be sure no one remained. "Go," he ordered. "I'm last," she coughed. In 2 strides, he closed the distance, wrapped the wet blanket around her, and lifted her as though she weighed no more than a child. The roof groaned and split above them as he carried her out into the night air, the cool wind hitting her lungs like water. Behind them, the schoolhouse collapsed in a wave of sparks and smoke. They didn't stop until they'd reached Graham's horse, tethered in the shadows. The children clustered nearby, wide-eyed but alive. Without explanation, Graham mounted, pulling Evelyn up in front of him. "Hold on," he said. "We're going to Shattered Mesa. It's the only place they won't follow." And with that, they vanished into the darkness. The trail to Whitecrest Ridge wound upward through dense pines and jagged shale, far from any beaten path. By the time Graham Cole led the last of the Mercer children into the clearing, the stars had begun to prick the sky. The ridge sat high above Redford Hollow, its slopes steep enough to keep out anyone who didn't belong. Below, a narrow creek whispered along the rocks, and the forest canopy cloaked their camp in a deep green hush. They made their shelter in a circle of canvas tents near a rock overhang that broke the wind. At dawn, smoke from their small cooking fire rose and vanished before it could betray them. Here, Evelyn could breathe without the scent of burning wood in her nostrils. Mornings belonged to her. She drew letters in the dirt with sticks, used flat stones as slates, and turned each lesson into a story. The younger children huddled close, their voices tentative as they sounded out new words. The older ones listened while pretending not to, lingering within earshot as they fetched water or chopped kindling. Afternoons were Graham's domain. He took the older boys into the trees, teaching them how to move quietly, read tracks in the soil, and set snares that could catch a rabbit or warn of an intruder. He showed them how to sharpen sticks, maintain a rifle, and read the wind. His methods were spare, his praise rare, but the boys followed him with silent, watchful eyes. The peace broke on the 7th night. A metallic snap rang out from beyond the tents, followed by a muffled curse. Graham was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving toward the sound with the fluid speed of a predator. In a small clearing, a man dangled upside down from one of Graham's rope snares, his leg twisted awkwardly in the loop. His face was half covered by a kerchief, but his eyes were sharp, defiant. "Who sent you?" Graham growled. The man spat dirt. "Doesn't matter. You've got something that'll get you killed." Evelyn stepped forward, holding the leather-bound ledger she'd hidden since the fire. "This?" she asked. His gaze flicked to it. That book's death. It's proof your mayor sold out the Mercers, and now he knows where you are. The night seemed to grow colder. Graham's jaw tightened. Then we move at first light, he said. And this time, we take the fight to him. Night settled heavy over White Crest Ridge. The fire reduced to glowing embers. The children slept in a haphazard ring of bedrolls, their breathing steady beneath layers of patched blankets. Evelyn Hart sat apart, knees drawn to her chest, staring into the darkness beyond the camp. Her fingers twisted the corner of the leather satchel that held the Mercer ledger, the weight of it pressing on her like a stone. When Graham Cole approached, she didn't look up. He set down 2 tin cups of coffee, the steam curling in the cold air. "You haven't slept," he said quietly. Her voice was raw. "Because of me, they've been running for their lives. Because I kept that ledger, because I thought I could fix something. 17 children almost burned to death." Graham stood for a long moment before sitting beside her, his elbows on his knees. "No," he said finally, "because of me." She turned to him, frowning. 7 years ago, he began, "I was hired to protect the Mercer land. Not the family, just the land. That was the deal I took. I posted up high and watched. I saw the smoke, heard the screams, and I didn't ride down. I told myself it wasn't my fight. Took the money and left. That ledger's proof I knew and did nothing." His gaze dropped to the firelight flickering over the dirt. "I've lived with that every day since." The confession hung between them, as sharp and unyielding as the ridge wind. Evelyn reached over, setting her hand near his on the ground. Not touching, but close enough that warmth crossed the space. "You're here now," she said, "and they need us both." For the first time that night, his eyes met hers. "Then we stop hiding," he said. Evelyn took a long breath, feeling the resolve harden inside her. "We take this ledger to the people. Show them the truth about Marcus Vine, no matter the risk." Graham nodded once. "We'll ride at dawn." They sat together in the stillness, the embers casting a dim halo over the camp. Above them, the sky stretched wide and endless, the stars scattered like a promise. In the distance, somewhere beyond the dark hills, lay Redford Hollow, and the reckoning waiting for them both. They rode into Redford Hollow at first light, the ridge wind still clinging to their coats. The children came in 2 wagons, Graham Cole driving the lead, Evelyn Hart seated beside him, with the Mercer ledger clutched tight in her lap. The town looked much as it had when she first arrived. Weathered facades, crooked shutters, dust drifting like smoke down the main street. But the air felt heavier, as if it knew trouble was coming. Behind the livery stable, they met Walter Briggs, a gray-bearded man with the bearing of someone who'd worn a badge. Once a federal ranger, Briggs had the steady eyes of a man who'd seen too much and forgotten nothing. He turned the ledger over in his calloused hands, scanning the pages. "This is his hand," Briggs said after a long pause. "Marcus Vane. No question. These signatures line up with federal cattle records from the same years." He tapped the crude map. "Enough here to bury him, if the town's willing to listen." By midday, the meeting hall was full. Farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, widows. Some came curious, others cautious. Evelyn stood at the front, the ledger open on a small podium. Graham waited beside her, watchful. Briggs addressed the crowd first, then stepped aside. "This isn't about vengeance," Evelyn began, her voice clear. "It's about truth, and giving 17 children the safety their parents died to protect." She read the entries aloud, naming Marcus Vane's dealings with the Red Bluff gang, the land seizure, the bribes. The room had just fallen into tense silence when the doors slammed open. 3 men in dusters strode in, rifles drawn. "Down!" Graham barked, pushing Evelyn behind a bench. But the Mercer children moved just as they'd been taught at White Crest Ridge. Noah and 2 older boys kicked shut the side doors, jamming crates against them. Lydia pulled down the blackout curtain while Caleb hurled rocks from behind the woodpile. In the chaos, Marcus Vane appeared, revolver in hand. He sneered. "Should have burned that ledger with the barn." He aimed for Evelyn, but Noah darted forward, hooking a rope around his ankles. Vane stumbled and Lydia struck him across the head with a heavy hymnal. The hall erupted, townsfolk surging forward. Guns were wrenched away, Vane dragged to his knees. For the first time in years, Redford Hollow stood together. Not in fear, but in defiance. By midsummer, Redford Hollow no longer carried the same hollow, beaten air. The dust still swirled and the old boardwalk still creaked, but something deeper had shifted, a kind of shared purpose that hadn't existed in years. The first sign of change stood right where the old barn had burned to the ground. From the first swing of the hammer, the new Mercer Hart schoolhouse was built with care. Cedar beams straight from the sawmill framed the walls. Fresh glass gleamed in every window. A small bell tower rose above the roofline, its bronze tongue ready to ring for beginnings, not for warnings. The front double doors were painted a deep, welcoming blue. Above them, hand-carved by a local carpenter, a sign bore the name Mercer Hart in proud letters. Evelyn Hart stood with the children the day it was unveiled, her hand pressed over her heart. Around her, the townsfolk who had once crossed the street to avoid her now smiled, tipped their hats, or shook her hand. Without debate, they voted her onto the newly formed education committee, the first in the town's history. While the school rose in the heart of town, changes took place on the edge of Graham Cole's ranch. A once empty spare room was fitted with shelves for books, a fire-warmed cot, and a small writing desk facing the sunrise. He never told Evelyn it was meant for her. He simply left the door open. From the ridge, they could see the schoolhouse's blue doors catching the morning light. It stood as more than a building. It was a promise. And though neither of them spoke of it, both knew it was also the beginning of a life they were quietly building together. The note was written in Graham Cole's plain, deliberate hand and left on Evelyn Hart's desk at the schoolhouse. Clear the afternoon, borrowing the oak tree. There was no signature. None was needed. When she arrived at the hill where the old oak stood, she stopped short. All 17 Mercer children were lined up beneath its wide branches, each in their best clothes, each holding a single wildflower wrapped in string. Their eyes shone with excitement they didn't try to hide. Graham stood a few paces beyond them, his coat pressed, boots freshly polished, but his expression holding a rare trace of nervousness. Evelyn walked toward him through the tall grass, the wind tugging at her skirt. There was no preacher, no music, no guests beyond the ones who had walked this road with them from the start. Graham didn't offer a speech. He simply held out his hand. She took it. They stood there, the oak's shadow a circle around them, while the children scattered petals in the grass. No vows were spoken aloud, because they had already been written. In the nights keeping watch together on Whitecrest Ridge, in the rebuilding of the school, in the moments they chose to stand rather than run. Their promise was in the quiet clasp of hands and the unspoken certainty in their eyes. Later, back at the ranch, Graham carried her over the threshold, not because tradition demanded it, but because he wanted to. They stepped onto the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the prairie in gold. Evelyn leaned against his shoulder, watching the land roll out toward Redford Hollow, where life moved with a steadier rhythm now. Below them, the school bell chimed in the evening breeze. The future wasn't without shadows. It never would be on the frontier. But standing there, they knew they had faced fire and fear and chosen to build something from the ashes. The story was never just about a teacher and a cattle baron. It was about second chances found in unlikely places, about the courage to face what hunts you, and the quiet strength it takes to build a home, not from walls and nails, but from trust and choice. And so, under the quiet sweep of prairie sky, Evelyn Hart and Graham Cole chose not just each other, but the life they would build. A life grounded in trust, courage, and the stubborn belief that even in the harshest places, hope can take root. Their story reminds us that bravery isn't always found in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in showing up, day after day, for those who depend on you. It's in telling the truth when silence would be easier, in repairing something broken simply because it needs to be done. In today's world, these lessons still ring true for us. Whether you're standing up for a neighbor, mentoring a child, or finding the strength to forgive yourself for past mistakes. We might not face cattle rustlers or dusty frontier towns, but we do face moments that ask, will you stand your ground? Will you choose compassion when it costs you something? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What lesson from Evelyn and Graham's journey speaks most to you? Do you believe people can truly change, or is redemption something we build over a lifetime? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your voice adds to the campfire circle where these tales still live. If you've enjoyed riding through this story with us, please give this video a like, subscribe to The West That Never Left, and share it with friends who appreciate stories that carry the grit of the past and the heart of the present. Because out here, whether on the frontier or in our modern lives, the West never really left. It lives on in the choices we make and the courage we keep.